In the end, things blew up. The start of the new Japanese government under Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi has been anything but smooth. It kicked off with a massive spike in the cost of public debt, and above all, a spectacular diplomatic crisis between Japan and China, a clash of a kind not seen in many years. And all because of Taiwan, and a few words from Takaichi that infuriated Xi Jinping.
If they, China, use warships, and that is accompanied with the use of force, then however you think about it, that could be a survival-threatening situation. The government would judge how to respond.
Basically, these words mean one thing, that Japan would defend Taiwan if China launched an invasion. This is something that no Japanese prime minister has ever stated so clearly before. In fact, it has drawn criticism from former Japanese leaders for its lack of tact and responsibility. To begin with, the previous prime minister, Shigeru Ishiba, labeled these remarks as mistaken, which, translated from the typically diplomatic, polite, and always soft-spoken Japanese, really means utterly unacceptable. And the thing is, when it comes to Taiwan, there has always been, or at least there used to be, a sort of silent consensus. More or less everyone knows what they would do if a conflict broke out, but no one is allowed to say it out loud. Not in a positive way, not in a negative way. And now Takaichi has broken that silence and turned everything upside down with Beijing. To the point that the Asian giant has already begun to implement a massive boycott that is starting to cause problems.
Chinese travelers cancel hundreds of thousands of trips to Japan amid rising tensions. Chinese airlines offer free cancellations and film releases postponed after Japanese PM's comments on Taiwan.
The first step has been the soft approach. Some good old economic punishment in the form of Made in China. It will escalate if the other side does not back down. As a result, Air China, China Southern, China Eastern, and other airlines in the Asian giant have allowed Chinese tourists to cancel their trips to Japan at no cost. In Chinese terms, this means that the government doesn't want its citizens to travel there. So, as a result, many are not traveling. Now, this may seem like a minor thing, but Chinese tourism is an important economic pillar for Japan. In 2024 alone, Chinese tourists spent $11.2 billion in the land of the rising sun. And in 2025, despite the year not yet being over, the figures already exceed those of the previous year. The fact is that when China wants to punish, it punishes where it hurts, the wallet. Of course, in the whole story we're about to tell you, keep one thing very clear. Tourism is the least of it. Take a look at this.
Your dirty, intruding neck must be cut off without a moment's hesitation. Are you ready for that?
What you've just seen is a post on X by the Chinese consul general in Osaka. Basically, a guy who really let loose. So much so that he even had to delete it. Now then, what if I told you that this comment on X might not just be an outburst from a thuggish official? Look, in a country like China, where political communication is treated with surgical precision, where an adjective can be read as a sign of loyalty or treason, it's hard to believe that a diplomat could write "cut off the neck" of another country's prime minister just because. This kind of language is too explosive to be a simple outburst. So the question is, why so much aggression? Why did China react as if Japan had all but declared war on them? Well, given that China and Japan have never gotten along particularly well, the origin of this sudden hatred may have been consciously fueled by the new prime minister herself. All of this may well be part of a very powerful tactical marketing operation aimed at the Japanese public, which doesn't exactly have a high opinion of China. In fact, just a few days after Takaichi was sworn in, she did something that Beijing considered a total affront. She met with Taiwan's representative at the APEC summit in late October, and that is when Xi's face began to contort. The Chinese leader had directly asked Takaichi to be careful with the Taiwan issue and other historical and territorial issues. Yet, as you can see, she decided to do the opposite, because the truth is that all this fuss is also working out perfectly for this prime minister. In a moment, I'll tell you why we say this, and why, along the way, she may also be unwittingly rolling out a kind of red carpet for Beijing's playbook. Now, some of you may be wondering, what playbook? What are we talking about? Is there more to this? Well, a lot more. You bet there is. Because behind the noise, the drama, the angry consul, and the Chinese cancelling flights, there are very calculated games being played. Games we've seen previously every time the Chinese regime wants to exert pressure both inside and beyond its borders. So the question is not whether Takaichi has provoked China for popularity. The question that really matters here is, why has China reacted so heatedly right now? Well, pay close attention because in this story, things are not what they appear.
Nothing is what it seems.
If there's one thing that defines East Asia, it's that nothing happens there just because. Nothing is improvised, nothing is spontaneous. Absolutely nothing in China's foreign policy happens by accident. Make no mistake about that. The events of recent weeks are a clear case of déjà vu in the recent history of tensions between China and Japan. Every time Japan says or does something that does not fit with the Chinese narrative, it gives Beijing the opportunity to activate a mechanism that is older than Xi Jinping himself: calibrated nationalism. In other words, it's a kind of switch that they turn on or off at their convenience. Japan becomes the perfect supporting character to stir up the public when the internal script requires it. It's perfect for this. Think about it. It's the old enemy that colonized China in the 20th century, the barbarian that committed numerous crimes, such as the infamous Nanking Massacre. It is perfect for heating up nationalist rhetoric. Now, if this is the case, the next question is, why is all this fuss coming at just the right time for China? Well, let's take a step back. This whole scandal starts at a very specific point in time. First, in the midst of an economic slowdown, which we will discuss later. And second, as we've already said, just as Takaichi came to power, a woman who seems to have no idea how to keep quiet about what, until now, had been silenced. And bear in mind that in a matter of weeks, she has already achieved what many Japanese leaders take years to achieve. Her popularity is sky high, at 75% according to the latest poll. She has also positioned herself very quickly on the international stage by meeting with strategic allies, and she has managed to earn a reputation as a reliable leader among the Japanese people. And on top of all this success, we have to add her first measures to increase defense spending and her comments on Taiwan, which have a very specific objective that I will tell you about in a moment. But that comes later. First, you need to understand why China, far from trying to de-escalate and giving Takaichi a way to walk her statements back, is doing exactly the opposite, going on the offensive. An offensive that, at the same time, is pushing Japan not to retract or soften its position, but to become even more assertive in order to avoid giving its own citizens the impression of surrendering to the Chinese Communist Party. And that is the worst thing that can happen to a local politician. Of course, this is only the tip of the iceberg out of a playbook that Xi Jinping has been following for years. Stay tuned. Let's travel back in time to the summer of 2012. The then Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihiko Noda announces the nationalization of the Senkaku Islands. These uninhabited rocks in the Pacific, located between Japan and China, were an administrative matter for Tokyo, but for China, they were and are a national symbol. Tokyo calls them Senkaku, Beijing calls them Diaoyutai. Well, just 4 days after that announcement, bam! Beijing was filled with protesters, as if someone had pressed a red button. Suddenly, thousands of people took to the streets in front of the Japanese embassy, burned flags, destroyed Japanese shops, and we even saw banners demanding that Japan become a province of China. The protests were massive. At first glance, it might have seemed like a spontaneous movement of patriots coming out to defend national sovereignty, but obviously, nothing could be further from the truth.
Remember, this is China, a country where political gatherings are not allowed unless it's in the government's interest. In fact, these types of protests are almost always organized in one way or another by the Chinese government itself. On that occasion, people from rural areas were transported to Beijing on free buses. They were even paid allowances.
Can you imagine? You get on a bus, they give you food, you arrive in the capital, and they say, here's your banner, shout loudly that Japan is the enemy. The question is, why on earth did all this happen? Well, just like today, it was no coincidence. In 2012, China wanted an external enemy.
The Chinese economy was at one of its peak moments. They had overtaken Japan as the world's second largest economy. They were still basking in the success of the 2008 Olympic Games, and the 2010 Shanghai Expo had been a showcase of soft power. And on top of that, foreign investment was pouring in. The feeling at the time was one of pride and prosperity.
So in that context, finding an enemy was a way to project strength and power without taking big risks. And here comes the most interesting part. In 2012, the Communist Party was so confident in its social control that it could afford to organize protests without fear of failure. But these days, that is no longer so clear. Think about it. Since Takaichi made her comment about Taiwan, have you seen any massive anti-Japanese demonstrations in China? Well, it's difficult because so far there hasn't been a single one. The fact is that the China of 2025 is no longer the China of a decade ago. Beijing is living in a fragile context, and this changes everything.
China registers worst investment decline in years as slowdown continues. Consumption also slowed, with retail sales on their longest run of decelerating growth since 2021.
Retail sales, one of the barometers of domestic consumption, have grown by just 2.9%, the clearest sign that families are spending less because they're afraid of the future. Industrial production and profits, which have always been China's driving force, are slowing down. And most alarmingly, investment in capital goods, in other words, the assets needed to produce more, has plummeted by 1.7%. This is the second time in decades that something like this has happened. It is yet another sign of certain symptoms of exhaustion, at least at certain levels of this economy. Don't forget that the real estate crash has done damage. They are dealing with it, but it has done damage. And alongside the real estate slump, we have demographic decline, industrial overcapacity, and fierce competition between companies, many of which survive on support from state-owned banks. You only have to talk to any Chinese person to see that things are not at their most optimistic. Mind you, I'm not saying that China doesn't have its strengths. Technologically, they've made a giant leap forward, but they do have problems, ones that mainly affect the working class. So in that context, allowing protests or encouraging them, as in 2012, could be counterproductive. But anyway, the key to all this is that it doesn't really matter what Takaichi said. What matters is when she said it. If Japan had said exactly the same thing 5 years ago, China would probably have responded more calmly. In other words, what has changed is not Japan, it's China. These days, Beijing needs more nationalism because it has less economic legitimacy, and Tokyo is the perfect target. That's the real reason why the state media has amplified the narrative that Japan is a provocative country and a destabilizing element for the region. And not surprisingly, they framed Takaichi as an aggressive leader who threatens peace. And take note, because as I said before, in this rhetorical game between former enemies, it's not only China that is playing. Behind Sanae Takaichi's statements on Taiwan, there's also a calculated move on Japan's part. A move that the new Prime Minister wants to become one of her government's greatest political assets. Pay attention. VisualPolitik community. The Japanese have been living for decades in a kind of self-imposed irrelevance in the regional context. Their imperialist and militarist past has always haunted them, and their pacifist constitution expressly urges them to avoid any kind of confrontation except in self-defense. Therefore, talking openly about defending a country other than Japan is something extremely novel for the Japanese, and novelty awakens feelings. What's more, when you not only say it, but insist on it, and refuse to clearly retract your statement, it stirs up even more feelings. But what exactly are we referring to? Well, the truth is that, thanks to this movement, the Prime Minister has placed herself in a position of strength at home. For now, not even the threat from the economic costs from the Chinese boycott is denting her popularity among voters. On the contrary, they have improved her image as a conservative woman of strong convictions, who is a true leader defending Japan's interests. Let's just say that Takaichi has struck a chord with the Japanese electorate, an electorate that is increasingly, and this is absolutely crucial, willing to question the country's pacifism. What's more, anti-Chinese sentiment is growing significantly within the country.
There are increasing complaints about excessive Chinese tourism. There are reports of Beijing's military expansion near the Japanese islands, and even reports blaming Chinese citizens for driving up rents and land prices by buying up real estate assets. These sentiments are becoming increasingly popular, especially among young people, a group that this Prime Minister wants to win over at all costs.
And do you know what? A recent poll shows that 64% of people between the ages of 18 and 39 approve of Takaichi's stance toward China, well above the general opinion of 56%. And the story doesn't end there. This dispute is also improving Japan's image in countries that have bigger territorial or maritime conflicts with Beijing, starting, of course, with Taiwan. In fact, Taipei has just lifted all restrictions on Japanese food imports that had been in place since the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster. The Taiwanese president has even posted a video of himself eating sushi. But let's pause here for a moment to explain something that is essential to understanding this story. The general opinion of analysts is that Takaichi's comment about the possibility of defending Taiwan was improvised, not planned. But once she was in a bind, the Prime Minister hoped to take advantage of the situation. This woman is part of the most conservative and nationalist wing of her party.
Takaichi has frequently visited the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, where the fallen of the Japanese Empire are honored, including 14 Class A war criminals. These visits have always been seen as provocative and insulting by former victims, including countries such as China and South Korea.
That's why China's reaction has been so strong. This is not just another diplomatic clash between countries. We're witnessing two nationalisms with conflicting histories colliding at full speed. For Beijing, Japan is a symbol, and they're exploiting it to their advantage. For her part, Takaichi cannot afford to back down, because that could mean her political death. She needs to withstand the blow dealt by Xi Jinping, just as other countries have done in the past.
China has taken a total of 43 retaliatory actions against the South Korean entertainment sector and trade goods in reprisal for Seoul's plan to deploy the US-made THAAD anti-missile system.
On that occasion, South Koreans endured about a year of boycotts. Chinese tourism plummeted by nearly 40%, and sales of South Korean brands within China fell sharply. Some large companies even had to abandon that market. But when China realized that its demands were not going to be met, everything suddenly returns to normal, and it remains that way to this day. So it's possible that something similar will happen with Japan. If Takaichi stands firm without backing down, she will score a very important political point at home, and in time, everything will most likely return to normal. Of course, we cannot ignore the possibility that things could get out of hand one day. So what could happen if China ultimately invades Taiwan? Could Japan really get involved in that fight? Well, that remains to be seen.
Could Japan protect Taiwan?
If war broke out in Taiwan tomorrow, could Japan really come to its aid? Well, according to China, no.
It would only suffer a crushing defeat at the hands of the ironclad Chinese People's Liberation Army and pay a heavy price.
Crushing. In Beijing's eyes, Japan would be knocked out as soon as it stepped into the ring. But is this true? To understand this, we must return to our protagonist, Sanae Takaichi. The Japanese Prime Minister has arrived with a very clear goal: to accelerate rearmament and turn Japan into a real strategic player in the Indo-Pacific. It's no longer a question of being in the shadow of the United States. Takaichi wants Japan to have its own voice. In fact, one of her first promises was to increase defense spending to 2% of GDP ahead of schedule. Tokyo wants to be prepared for whatever happens, or at least it wants to appear to be. Now then, let's not get ahead of ourselves. The problem is that Japan alone could not come to Taiwan's aid, no matter what Takaichi says. It would definitely need the involvement of its allies.
Tokyo is clearly outmatched. It is evident that the Chinese People's Liberation Army is gigantic, and Japan cannot stand up to it alone. The Chinese armed forces outnumber the Japanese 8-1 in terms of personnel, 7-1 in terms of warships, and 5-1 in terms of military spending. Even taking into account that Japan's military technology is superior, it would be unthinkable to consider a conflict in which they participated alone, especially after years and years of military underfunding.
Therefore, the key to whether or not Japan could defend Taiwan lies not in Japan, but in what its allies would do. In this case, the countries to look at would be mainly these two: the United States, and due to its proximity and strength, South Korea. But first, let's look at the United States. Japan has always assumed that the United States would be there, but right now there is a small detail to consider in the White House, one called Donald Trump. And in regards to Taiwan, Trump has been anything but clear. His statements range from, "We must defend the Taiwanese with everything we have," to, "Why should we protect a country that steals our technology?" And clearly for Japan, this uncertainty is a considerable problem, especially when we consider that the Trump administration is completely focused on its famous "Make America Great Again" slogan.
It should also be remembered that when Beijing stormed Hong Kong's institutions in violation of all international agreements and took complete control of the city, Trump was also in power and did absolutely nothing to prevent it. Therefore, if China were to launch an invasion of Taiwan, for example, in 2027, which is the date that some analysts are beginning to consider, Trump would probably do the bare minimum to prevent it.
At the very least, the risk of this happening is too great for the Japanese to put only themselves in the firing line of a regional conflict. The situation is somewhat similar with South Korea, but for different reasons. Like it or not, Seoul is not going to get involved in a war against China for two reasons as big as an aircraft carrier. First, China is South Korea's largest trading partner, and also a supplier of key resources that are essential to South Korean industry. Second, South Korea competes directly with Taiwan in the chip industry. The technological and economic heart of South Korea is Samsung and SK Hynix, and that of Taiwan is TSMC. Both countries are competing to dominate the most strategic industry on the planet. And while Takaichi is thinking thinking in terms of political calculations regarding Taiwan, for Seoul, Taiwan is more of an industrial rival. So, from here on, the situation is clear. Japan says it would help Taiwan. China says it would crush it. The United States is unpredictable, and South Korea is complicated on this issue. In any case, the reality is that after all the noise, inflammatory statements, flight cancellations, hysterical consuls, and warnings of defeat, the truth is much simpler. This is all a calculated political game on both sides. Sanae Takaichi has lit a fuse, is now taking advantage of it, and in the process has given Xi Jinping a wonderful tool for rekindling national fervor. Both countries are winning with this story, and most likely Taiwan is only being used by both sides as a means of diplomatic pressure, nothing more than that. Now, what about you? What do you think? Do you believe that Japan would really defend Taiwan against China if it came to that? Or, as Takaichi has suggested, or when push comes to shove, would the Japanese have no room for maneuver if their allies did not play along? What do you think about using issues like these to try to gain political capital on both sides? Well, leave your opinions below in the comments and let's see what you think. But first, very important, if you like this video, hit the like button and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't done so already. As always, thank you so much for being there. Take care. I'll see you soon.